Welcome to the 2024 CIBSE Presidential Address. Oh, yeah, there we go. Presidencies are platforms for change. No one gets very long, which allows for rapid change and multiple perspectives over time. Less time to mess up too. They're a little bit about the individual and mostly about the institution, and people are picked for their skills and their views, and then we have to rise to the occasion. So in thinking about how to rise to the occasion, I used two questions. The first one is, what do I bring? And the second is, what difference can I make? So I'm going to start with a short introduction to me that perhaps sets the frame for what I bring. The first thing is that's a teapot. And the reason I put a teapot up is because I think that design is incredibly important. And the reason I put the teapot up is because small differences can make a really big difference to how you feel and how you interact with a thing or a place. And I know that all of you will be familiar with a teapot, and you will all have a favorite somewhere, or a teacup, or a tea mug, or something. The second is design should be a matter of public discourse, in my mind. Prince Charles made it so in the 1980s when I was first starting. But while there is a really strong tradition of arguing in Britain and a sense of collective experience, we don't have a very strong dialogue about design, small or big D. I believe that dialogue to be important, especially in the built environment, where the things we make are expensive, carbon intensive, long lasting, and a part of all of our lives. Design isn't just about form, and function has to be understood pretty broadly. It's really easy to fall in love with the diagram, at least as if you're me. And in this case, as a 16-year-old who had always lived in a house, I loved the idea that you could live in an apartment and go upstairs to bed. So interlocking L shapes are the cross-sectional basis for Corbusier's unité d'habitation. All the apartments are two-storey, which means you can go upstairs to bed. I really like that as somebody who grew up in a house. Diagrams are important because they bring clarity, but they can be inappropriately seductive if the design problem hasn't been fully defined. And then the last one is there are some problems that really shouldn't be solved. In this case, you shouldn't think that putting a conference room in a glass bowl is a good idea, although I spent a very large number of hours in my very early days at Arup making it a comfortable place to be. My career has been about mechanical engineering design and sustainability and energy efficiency, and my best and most notable projects have been those where I've led a multidisciplinary engineering team to deliver a complex project. And here are some of those projects. So the Fulton Street Station is the bottom left, the Frick Chemistry Lab is the bottom right, the US Embassy in London you probably all recognize, and the Emma and Georgina Bloomberg Center at Cornell Tech is the top right. And they're four buildings that they're kind of big and they're major, and actually the thing that I liked about all of them is they had a very, very clear statement of design intent at the beginning. So that's what I bring, and the second question is, what difference can I make? So the presidency is a partnership, I think, between the individual and the institution, with the individual as the minor partner. And CIBSE covers the full breadth of building services from facades to digital technology, elevators, lighting, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and fire systems. And our members work at all stages of a building's life, from conception to design to construction to commissioning to operations to decommissioning. And even with that list, I'm pretty sure I've missed some people out. So as an institution, rather than as a commercial entity, we are in an ideal spot for convening and advocating because we are not seeking direct financial gain from our advocacy. That means we can be a robust and independent voice in driving change, and our charter requires that we act in the public interest. So how does this come together? I'm a designer at heart, and I mean that really broadly. I'm interested in figuring out how we get from the current state to a desired future state. And CIBSE, as an institution and as a group of professionals, are the experts in building performance. So the question on my mind for this presidential year is, what is the future of building performance? And how do we get there? And that's what the rest of my talk and perhaps my presidential year are about. So why do we even need to bring up this question? Surely we have a good understanding of building performance. We run something called the Building Performance Awards, and we have a conference called Build to Perform, so aren't we already the experts? And I'm reminded quite regularly over the last year, actually, by Adrian, of Terry Wyatt's CIBSE Presidential Address in 2003, where he said something along the lines of adapt or die. And the shock of that statement reverberated through the institution for some time, apparently till 2024, and the key message is kind of the same. Change is constant, and right now we're seeing change happen pretty quickly. So I think there are four big changes that you can sort of see, I can see, from my advantage point as somebody in the industry. So firstly, this is a clock in Union Square, which is close to where I live in New York. And it's a countdown clock for climate change. It basically says 7 years, 102 days, 12 hours until we have to solve the climate crisis, else it's all too late. I'm not sure about the time and date, but I do know that this picture is 2 years old, so it now says 5 years, 102 days. But 10 years ago, you would never have had that. It was really unimaginable. The idea is now really mainstream. Secondly, there's always been a lot of discourse about whether people are getting and paying their fair share for government services, especially in the middle of an election. But in the US, there was a huge change around the Black Lives Matter movement, which happened during the pandemic, in the understanding of the additional risks of all kinds that poorer communities face. And as an example, in this country, as we near the 7th anniversary of the Grenfell Tower fire, we see increasing dialogue and clearly not enough action around the effect of social inequality on individual safety. Thirdly, anybody who watches nature around them knows that things are changing. In recent years, we have been able to make decent sparkling wine in Cornwall, but we also see new bugs, new tree diseases, and fewer house sparrows. We are starting to address this. In 2022, there was a biodiversity conference of parties in Montreal, and now we see nature and biodiversity disclosures starting to be required in financial statements. And then finally, we see change in digital. Every day, there are hundreds of articles about the impact or control of AI and machine learning. They are all about potential at this point, but it's already banal to say that this is likely to be as big a change as the internet. This, of course, is an entirely unstructured way of looking at change. It's emotionally useful because you can see it, but it's really likely to miss things. So for the last few months, CIBSE have been working with the Arab Foresight team to take a proper look at what is changing and how this might impact our understanding of building performance. This work has used the STEEP framework, which looks at drivers of change in 5 categories: social, technological, economic, environmental, and political legal. And this is understood to cover everything. So if those are the change drivers, what are building services engineers to do about it? Climate change alone would be enough of an impetus for our profession to change, and it has over the last few years, as we have realized that buildings are responsible for 39% of energy-related carbon emissions. We have changed from a focus on energy efficiency, which you talk about for tactical reasons and cost savings, to driving to net zero carbon in operations, and we're increasingly driving to net zero across the whole building life cycle for bigger picture reasons than cost. But this is not the only driver of change. Looking at the steep changes and my 4 obvious kind of drivers, we can see that buildings have a much wider impact. It's also clear that some of those impacts overlap. For example, as the built environment increases in area, ecosystems are impacted, and biodiversity measures and air and water quality can also change. So the expensive, long-lasting, carbon-intensive buildings that form the backdrop to our lives must be designed, operated, maintained, handed over, and even demolished in ways that we understand to be high-performing. And while I don't have the answers about what exactly is changing, I am sure that thinking about the future is useful. So what is building performance? I don't expect you to read this. Back in 2016, CIBSE looked at this question, and they developed this mind map, which has usefully guided the institution's thinking to date. It's a really solid, in-the-moment mapping of the things that building owners and occupants care about. And what the owners and occupants and society care about, or what they value, must be the primary drivers of what we think about when we think about performance. From this mindset, this one here, we could frame a well-performing building as one that has a mechanical system that provides occupant comfort most of the time, at minimal energy use, and at a price the owner can afford. And that, of course, is right, but it doesn't really feel like enough. The mechanical engineers in the room are going, really? That's enough? And the more I thought about building performance, the more I started to see that what is valued depends a lot on context. So specifically who you are relative to the building and what you need. So one way to think about the personal context of building users is to think about it in terms of the hierarchy of needs. And when we have no shelter or sanitation, a building that provides those things is pretty high performance. But once we have those things, they tend to fade into the background, and we begin to look for more. We look for thermal comfort, we look for the way in which the building supports our work or living practices, and eventually, perhaps, for what it says about ourselves as people. Building users aren't the only people who value building performance, though. Investors and owners and managers, maintenance staff, and the community also value building performance. In some cases, the value arises in ways that are very building-specific or purpose-specific. The examples here are of buildings that have very, very particular requirements. But even for specialist buildings, the investors and owners and managers will have a hierarchy of needs and may therefore think of value as basic functionality or, at the other extreme, the ability of the building to support the activities needed to save civilization. You might be thinking about now that I'm stretching the point. How on earth does a building owner get to a point where they are self-actualizing through their buildings? And the analogy I want to draw is around the way that LEED and BREEAM and building rating systems sort of changed the way that we look at building performance and changed the way that the market thinks about building sustainability. And they eventually did it by becoming desirable. As a colleague of mine put it, as an industry, we need to switch from a compliance mindset to a performance mindset. The former will only set a baseline. The anything less would be a legal mark, whereas the latter helps us advance and meet stretch targets. So, desirability, that impetus to meet a stretch target. Interesting, once the shift to desirability happened, it wasn't only the lowest level of stretch performance that became desirable, it was the upper levels of stretch performance that became desirable. And once the pioneer buildings had tested the technology and brought the price down and proved that it was possible and meant that nobody had to be first, owners made choices to be seen as climate heroes or self-actualizing by claiming and aiming for higher levels of certification. CIBSE has changed the market too. I hadn't expected to put up a frog when I started talking about CIBSE, but that is what I meant to do, through awards and technical advancement and to increase the desirability of high performance. And this is why we must and how we can use our thinking about building performance to shape the future we want to see. And we should note, as a famous frog once said, it's not easy being green. Right up at the top, I said that I bring a designer's sense to problem solving. And there are two things that are needed to design something. The first is a complete and clear understanding of the problem, including all of the constraints. And the second is a kind of creative, iterative process of designing and testing that is rooted in knowledge. So what we are trying to do here, I think, is to design our way to built infrastructure and human processes that give us higher performance buildings at all stages, from design to deconstruction. And the first challenge is to understand the problem. So we're in the squiggle part of this. And at this point, I think it's worth considering Einstein, who said something like, if I had an hour to solve a problem and my life depended on it, I would spend 55 minutes understanding the problem, because then it would be easy to find the solution. We may not be all geniuses like Einstein, and it may not therefore be easy to solve that problem, but the kind of ready aim phase of a project is really important to getting the shot on target. So far, we've seen we're in a period of rapid change with drivers across the whole of the steep spectrum. We've seen that what a high-performance building is depends entirely on your context. And we have seen that institutions and individuals have been driving towards developing and changing ideals of high performance for many years, and that we have, both as an institution and as individuals, significant agency in driving buildings to higher performance. So to drive that change, we need to get ahead of the world around us in how we think about performance. Not far ahead, but far enough ahead to be both inspirational and aspirational, and to do it not dogmatically, because change is constant, so we have to keep changing our minds about what high performance really is. So CIBSE has spent the last few months in a collaborative effort facilitated by our Foresight team to try to get just that little bit ahead of the curve, to see what's around the corner, to understand the problem as broadly as we can. We've been working to flip the script. As an outsider looking in on our society, one could assume from our current approach to building performance that the thing we value most of all is compliance, a reduction in professional and personal risk. My experience is that this is not true of us as individuals. Engineers often want to push the boundaries on technical solutions for the right ends, but our current industry approach to building performance does not seem to reflect those values. So the result of those few months of work is a new report, which I think many of you have in your hands, Building Performance Reimagined, which combines the expertise of building services specialists with insights from a diverse range of subject matter experts across arts, technology, and the public sector. And very carefully reached out beyond the industry to get those inputs, because different perspectives on change, and because of this, how's the water? I don't know. What's water? So the work we've done is not typical CIBSE work. The problem is not really known, and we're not planning to guide you stepwise towards a solution. But even with professional help, focusing the discussion on building performance in a useful way has been a really slippery process. So one of the ways we started to think about performance was in terms of sliders, individual benefit to collective social usefulness, or pre-handover performance peak to post-handover learning and improvement. But it turned out to be a lot of them, and we thought we might spend the rest of our lives arguing about which end of the scale was more desirable and how quickly or how far along we should move, because it depends on building type, it depends on purpose, it depends on all of those things in the hierarchy of needs. It was a pretty helpful exercise, but it was too tight a framework. So the report itself outlines 4 core themes that relate directly to the changing values of our society and explore possible concepts and features of future buildings, as well as innovative ways that future needs may be met. A lot of it is quite playful. We can't see the future clearly, if at all, and to do so, we need to break the current way of thinking. So back to Einstein, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used to create them. We have to take a different view. So we hope and think that the framework, the 4 themes of variety, connectedness, readiness, and the emergence of new ideas will give CIBSE and each of you solid ground for a new holistic approach to building performance. So firstly, variety. The challenges we're trying to meet are broad and impactful and dynamic, and so are all of our lives. The built spaces, indoor and outside, that we live in need to be able to accommodate different uses at different times and to fulfill different needs for different groups. We can broaden the design problem to include support of biodiversity or human well-being, as well as its sort of initially stated purpose. In this theme, we explore how building services might be used to optimize space, promote diverse uses, and support diverse users. There are a lot of ideas here, and we expect that you will find others. Secondly, was connectedness. Our buildings have really broad impacts on the communities where they are placed. For example, we might see this through historic right to light legislation, and they are also inextricably linked to local water, electrical, fuel networks. Our current practice is to stop building design at the outside wall and manage operations on the building side of the meter, because we have control over those things. But is this the best we can really do? If a building can generate power it doesn't need, shouldn't that power be fed back to the grid? If a building can manage its rainwater on site, wouldn't it be good if it did that rather than lead to sewage overflows elsewhere? The barrier to these kinds of ideas tends not to be technical. It's about control and liability and cooperation, things that need some chutzpah to challenge. How we might find other ways to work together that make the best of the investments we are making, especially at a time of rapid grid transition. If we want to make rapid change, should we have a different approach to sharing ideas and solutions more, so that we have more giants on whose shoulders to stand? Should we be better at learning from each other? Ideas around connectedness could also help us as we think through the third part of the framework. We know that design conditions are changing. The likelihood and intensity of flood and fire and windstorms are all changing. And with the heavy investment of resource in building projects and the shift to thinking about whole life cycle carbon, we have to be concerned about the very long-term impacts of what we build. If we return to the hierarchy of needs idea, what we value about building performance after an extreme weather event might be different to how we value that building under normal times. Could we pay more attention to how the building supports the community after an event and counts those things as elements of building performance? As we have explored these ideas, it became clear that as our expectations change, new ideas emerge. And so the fourth part of our framework is about emergence. As an example, it's likely obvious to all of you today that as buildings operations use less carbon, building construction uses relatively more. But this might not have been quite so obviously top of mind 5 years ago. In the broader world, it's becoming clear that there are some materials that are quite scarce and that are essential to the energy transition. Might this shape how we think about reuse and recycling? And as that happens, might we arrive at new ways of thinking about nutrition labeling for building products? And won't that feed into what we understand as building performance? And so on. There are clearly more questions than answers in this framework, and that is the point. To resolve the design challenge, we have to have understood the problem. There's a lot of time in that wiggly section of the diagram, including all of its constraints, and that means opening up our thinking to the bigger picture. We can't know what is going to happen next, but we can look for the possibilities that will impact our own careers, the buildings we design, make, operate, and occupy, and the consequences of our ideas and decisions on the societies we live in. As we reflect, we see that change is constant, a fact that can be pretty daunting, especially when we consider the scale and scope of the changes. a climate crisis, social unease, mass extinctions, water quality, just to name a few. It's no wonder it's sometimes difficult to feel like any of us individually has any agency. Moving from a reactive to a proactive position requires quite a lot of courage. But we have the power, especially as building services engineers, and that wasn't supposed to be a pun, to shape the future. To do that, we have to be sure, or at least some of us have to be sure, that we have something to bring. And we all do, as humans and as citizens, but in our case, also as professionals in the field, committed to the art and science of building sciences engineering for the benefit of society. That said, there isn't a stepwise guide here. What I hope is that the document and this talk will give you a starting point to think critically and proactively about what the future should look like through the lens of building performance, and then to step forward to design our way there. I know that this won't be easy. It requires skill and knowledge and technical expertise, motivation, innovation, and bravery, rather like this, to construct a new definition of high-performance buildings, one that is both responsive to the changes around us and that helps us drive towards the change we want to see. Our work needs a really strong understanding of the detail, to see the minutiae and to bring to bear the very best skills, knowledge, and technical expertise. It is our engineers' deep understanding of the detail that gives us the insight to find new ways of doing things that will actually work. My challenge to you is to balance the details with a broader view, to see, if you will, not just the dandelion seed on which you are focused, but the whole field. Not just to find the motivation and courage to understand the challenges facing society, but to shift your mindset so that you see them as opportunities and as part of the definition of our design problem, and also a chance to use your own special skill and expertise to shape the future you want to see by working at the point at which we, and you individually, and we as an institution can have most impact. Thank you.